Street photographers can be quite an opinionated bunch, and you may have heard a lot of bad advice without even realising it, which can end up halting your progress as a photographer. So by the end of this video, you'll know some of the worst advice you can get about street photography, and also what you can do instead to help you be more creative and make better photographs. So let's get right into it. Something that I've heard a lot from opinionated street photographers is that you should always use the viewfinder and absolutely never shoot from the hip. But this is simply not true. Shooting from the hip is actually a great technique to try, as it offers a completely different perspective than just shooting at eye level. There's a bit more luck involved when shooting from the hip, and there's of course less control over your composition. That can be freeing, and it can lead to some different results rather than just photos taken at eye level all the time. If you have a fold out screen, it's easier to take photos from the hip, as you can just look down to frame up your photograph. If not, then through trial and error and a lot of practice, you can still get used to framing up photos instinctively from the hip. Also, if you're a beginner, this can be a great and unobtrusive way to build your confidence taking photographs of people in public. A photographer that did this so well is Vivian Meyer, who often used her Rolleiflex film camera looking down through the viewfinder while taking photos from the hip level, making the subjects look imposing and powerful. So if you hear people saying not to shoot from the hip, then just ignore them. When done well, it can be a great technique to explore in your street photography. This one I hear quite a lot. You must not photograph homeless people or street performers or children on the street. It's not ethical and they make for boring, cliche photos. Well, I would argue that that's just simply not the case. If you're anything like me, then you want to document life and moments on the street with your photography. So if you don't include children, homeless people or street performers, then that would mean you're sort of missing out on documenting the full picture of what the streets are really like. I never take photographs in public with malicious intent. I just take photographs of things I find interesting personally, but that doesn't mean that I will show the work after I've taken it. Legally in the UK, you can photograph anyone or anything in a public place, but that also doesn't mean it's ethical to do it. In my opinion, photographs of homeless people especially can be lazy images that aren't powerful, a bit cliche, and at worst exploitative. But what about a photo of some police confiscating a homeless person's sign and then moving them on? That would be worth documenting in my opinion, and it's important to show what's really happening around us in this point in time. Ultimately, it comes down to your own ethical views, but to say you shouldn't take photographs of certain things isn't right in my opinion. You should take photographs of whatever you want, and then you can of course use your judgment to decide if you want to show it to other people based on your own ethics down the line. Often you might hear that real street photographers use a wide-angle lens with a high f-stop to capture a sharp frame front to back, and that's the best way of doing it. That's not good advice. Sure, that's one way of doing it, but that's not the only way, and the great masters of street photography have of course shot anything from wide angle to telephoto and wide open all the way up to f/22. For me, when it comes to lens and aperture choice, it depends on your style, but also the light you're shooting in. Beginners though can often be tempted to open up their brand new prime lens as wide as it will go, giving that super creamy bokeh or blurry background to isolate a subject. But that will mean that you lose contextual information in your frames. There's nothing wrong with shooting that way, especially if you like a more abstract approach. It just comes down to personal choice. I like shooting with a 35mm full frame equivalent lens as I want to include the environment in my frames. And I generally use an f-stop of 8 or above to get a deep depth of field because I like to include a lot of elements and want everything to be acceptably sharp. If the light is poor or if I'm shooting in the evening or at night, then I'll open up the aperture right up and change my approach a bit. Sometimes I'll be in the mood for more abstract street photography or candid portraits, for example, which I'll generally use a longer focal length for. If you constrict yourself to one way of doing things and never experiment, you might never reach your full potential as a photographer. What lens or depth of field you choose is up to you to achieve the results you want to get with your street photography, so don't let anyone tell you there's a right or wrong lens or aperture to use. The last year or so, I've been focusing on more documentary style street photography, which is all about trying to capture a fleeting moment in time. A lot of street photographers like this approach, but I've seen a lot of work out there, including mine, that throws compositional skill out the window in favour of capturing a moment. You might hear street photographers say, well, composition doesn't really matter, it's all about the moment, but this is really not the case. I would say the moment is probably the most important thing about the content of a street photo, a feeling, emotion, gesture, or whatever it is that caught your eye. But following very closely second is how you choose to compose that moment in the frame. It can be hard to use strong compositional technique when you're capturing spur of the moment scenes on the street, but I find photos of an amazing moment are so much more powerful when composed well. So I think it's really important to learn the basics of good compositional technique, like leading lines, rule of thirds, triangles and so on, but also to dive into more complex ideas about composition in art and photography in general to understand why there are compositional rules. You can only break rules and experiment when you know what the rules are and why they're there in the first place. If you practice composition regularly, then the more likely you are to instinctively capture well-composed moments on the street. Which leads us nicely into today's video sponsor, which is Skillshare. I'm always looking to improve my street photography skills, and while I've been focusing more on moments in street photography lately, my composition has gone a little bit lacking. But luckily, Skillshare has exactly what I need to really level up my compositional skills. Specifically, I've been watching the 9 composition lessons from street photographer Craig Whitehead, aka 6 Street Under, where he breaks down powerful compositional techniques for exciting street photos. It's really helped me get back on track with my composition. And for those of you that want to learn from a master of storytelling, I highly recommend Andre D. Wagner's class on street and documentary photography. He really elevates street photography to a high art form, and following along with him behind the scenes has given me so much inspiration to go out and shoot, as well as loads of ideas to try on my next photo walk. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, with thousands of classes led by industry experts across film, illustration, design, freelance productivity, and so much more. Whatever you're looking to improve, Skillshare can help you take your skills and passions to the next level. So if you want to level up your skills, the first 500 people to use the link in the description to join Skillshare will get a 1-month free trial. So join the community and check it out. A big thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. I hear this one a lot. Film is better than digital, or street photographers who shoot on film are more talented to digital photographers. I don't agree with that at all. What I do think is that film looks better. It's impossible to make a digital edit really look like it was shot on film, but what I don't agree with is that film is better than digital or vice versa. They're just different tools that lead to photographs. While film photos look great, it's a prohibitive option for many now due to the sky-high prices of film and development. But on the flip side, if it's within your means, the process is very different to digital shooting and arguably more enjoyable. Digital photography, on the other hand, is available to most, or at least anyone who has a smartphone. And this is great because it means so many people can get into photography and the enjoyment of it all. But at the same time, you can go out and take 5,000 photos in a day if you want to, which can lead to having too much choice. And no matter how hard you try, I don't think you can really get the film look 100% right on digital edits. Whichever process works best for you is what you should go with. Actually, that applies to all gear in general. Whatever tool makes you want to get up and go out and take photos is the best one, not megapixels or film stock. When I first started street photography, I was obsessed by sharpness in my photos. I'd done a lot of landscape photography in the past where I used to marvel about the power of my modern camera and how sharp it can render a scene. And a lot of people I've come across are also obsessed with sharpness and resolution on their cameras. This does not matter at all in street photography, in my opinion. In fact, always trying to get nice sharp images that freeze action can actually hold you back as a photographer. Let me explain. If you're constantly worrying or thinking about how to get the sharpest image possible and freezing action, then it stops you from being as creative as you can be. Instead, you can be much more creative if you focus less on the technical side. Try zone focusing, try a slower shutter speed than you're used to, try strange compositions, embrace imperfection. Some of my favourite photos I've taken recently aren't tack sharp. They have unusual compositions, or they focus more on the moment rather than technical perfection. It's often these images which aren't perfect that have more soul and resonate much more with the viewer. After all, life is hardly perfect, is it? And that's what we should want to capture and convey with our street photography, in my opinion. This is a classic thing that I'm sure you've heard before. You must never crop your photos. You need to get it right in camera, and cropping is cheating. Well, this is just such poor advice. If you think about it, every photo you take is already cropped. You don't take a photo of a 360-degree view of the world. You choose what part you want to frame with your camera and then capture that slice of time. I personally try to get it right in camera. I don't like to crop much because I really like the look of images made with a 35mm lens. But you can really make amazing work which you've cropped. It's not cheating, it's just further reducing your frame. You still saw the moment and then made the decision that you actually wanted to leave a little bit more out of the scene, and that's a perfectly valid artistic choice. Having said all that, sometimes it can actually be really good for a beginner to try not to crop, as this forces you to learn from your mistakes, because the more you can get right in camera, generally the better your street photography skills get. At the end of the day, cameras now have sensors with massive resolution, which means that you can crop really far in. So why not use modern tools to your advantage and crop if you want to? As I always say, it's great to experiment, so you should never let anyone tell you there's a right or wrong way to do something when it comes to art. A lie that you really need to ignore is if you hear someone say you're not a real street photographer if you do or don't do things a certain way. As I've mentioned in this video already, just like any art form, there's no right or wrong approach, and people telling you that the photography you do is or isn't street or whatever is just counterproductive and doesn't help anyone. Just go your own way and listen to the people you resonate with and ignore the rest. While some street photographers are very opinionated, which can be really discouraging, especially for beginners, don't let that put you off, because there's also a huge community of open-minded and creative street photographers out there who'll be more than happy to help you and provide useful advice when you bump into them on the street. In this video, we've discussed some bad advice that you should really be ignoring so you can reach your full potential as a street photographer. But what about some ideas with actionable advice to focus on to improve your street photography? Well, that's where this video comes in.